can see something. Okay,
bet.
very good. Okay, all right. I'm going to assume that that'll just go along as it should. Okay, there's, if you go to that link, that's another way to get to the table of contents, which is essentially what we're providing. The New Rural Economy Project was established in 1997. So it has been, we've just celebrated our 25th year, where actually some of our alumni got together. It included more than 20 researchers from all across the country, several of them international, and over 120 students from more than 14 universities participated, along with about 35 partners, domestic and international. So it was a major project, both from the point of view of Canada, but if we look at it from an international point of view, it was a unique and fairly influential project that linked us with countries, mostly OECD countries, over that period of time. The project was very collaborative in the sense that we ended up including not just researchers and students and academics, but community members, policymakers from both within Canada and internationally. That you can see, for example, I've put in some links there that you can take a look at and browse on your own. The key one is the nre.concordia.ca. That would in turn link you to quite a number of other of the activities. One of the important features, if we ask what we did, one of the important features that was developed by the New Rural Economy Project was what we call the Rural Observatory. This included the selection and collaboration with 32 rural and remote sites across the country, identified here. We used a very systematic approach that provided significant advantages for research and particularly for comparison. We had noticed in looking at the material that was available that we often found one-off studies, maybe case studies and so on, but that were selected on accidental, really, criteria. What we thought we would do would be to identify a sample that allowed us to compare in a meaningful way some of the differences that we find, and then to apply a consistent methodology and approach in order to provide a basis for comparisons. Our Japanese colleagues thought, oh, well, this is very, very impressive. Can we do the same in Japan? And so with our help, they selected 2 sites in Japan and ran a parallel and comparative project with ours. One of those sites, just in parenthesis, was significantly affected by the Fukushima nuclear disaster. They had to evacuate the whole population. And there are links through the NRE that, if you're interested in that, will fill you in on the impacts of that event on that particular community. The design not only allowed us to understand the dynamics within each site, but also to make comparisons across site, thereby separating out some of the characteristics that are unique to each site from those that are due to contextual conditions. It also makes possible the comparison of our sites with any other community sites in which researchers or community members may be involved, thereby increasing the value of those studies significantly. So many of the case studies or one-off studies can be linked to and compared with sites that we have in the Rural Observatory. So think about this if you were involved in or planning community research along the way. We also organized theme teams and partners around 4 themes that we felt we were reasonably competent to deal with. The governance issues, environmental issues, services, and communications were the 4 themes that we established early in the New Rural Economy project. And the teams were asked to identify and document the economic, social, and political processes that got communities to where they were, to assess what are some of the key drivers and processes in those aspects, and to identify and evaluate the community and policy options for the future. So there was a lot of work that was conducted in those areas throughout the whole period of the New Rural Economy project. We also collected and analyzed information. These included community profiles, descriptive, statistical, multimedia, longitudinal types of information. We set up and conducted our own surveys in a systematic fashion, looking at households and small and medium-sized enterprises and co-ops, institutions, local perceptions of the people, events. We covered and kept track of events that were taking place in the communities, communications and environmental issues. And we attempted to integrate various administrative data sources like tax filer or municipal finances or health data into the information that we had. I see this history that we've had and the kind of legacy fits very well with some of the discussions that will be coming up later on in the AGM, where we're still desperately trying to organize and get together information and data about small and remote places in a way that allows us to be confident in our analysis and proposals relating to that. We also collaborated with the communities in a consistent fashion. Right from the beginning, we involved community members and policymakers and researchers through the use of conferences and workshops. Most of these were surf-related projects, conferences and workshops. The other thing that we did is we mostly met in rural and remote communities. This is strategic to us, not only for our own edification, but to get policymakers out to rural and remote places about which they were making policies. I think this was one of the most significant factors in the project because we shared a common experience with a wide variety of places. And this affected both the nature of our discussion, but also the kinds of issues that we focused on. We facilitated what we call cross-site involvement and learning. That is, one community going and meeting with other communities, talking about their own situation and comparing notes in terms of experiences and responses. We facilitated the evaluations of our research work by including these community members because they were there to say, hey, what are you talking about? Well, this isn't what's happening in our site, or this doesn't seem consistent, or yes, this is a good, important point. And we explored a wide variety of what were in those days called knowledge mobilization activities and products. Conferences, workshops, flyers, posters, traditional electronic media, webinars, social media, and podcasts. This was during a period where it was all the use of the internet was in its infancy. So we have a fair amount of experience and things to say, actually, about strategies for working with groups spread out as we have with SURF over so many years. We proposed and evaluated policies as well. on topics such as community capacity, social cohesion, rural-urban relations, the informal economy, and so on. And this was manifested as our participation as invited witnesses and consultants for parliamentary committees and departments. In the Senate House Committee, the Rural Secretariat, which was flourishing at that point in time. We prepared reports and presentations. You can see those if you follow up some of the links through the NRE site. And we did a lot of training of students. The students were involved in all aspects of the project, from its design, administration, analysis, and knowledge mobilization. You'll hear a little bit about that from some of the other people that will be speaking to you. And we supported others. We supported the International Comparative Rural Policy Seminar Series that met in Norway, Quebec, Italy, Mexico, Ireland, Alaska, Spain. I invite any of you who would be thinking about developing your exposure and experience, any of you people who are in formal education, to take a look at the ICERPS project and see whether you could join them for their summer institute. The Canada-Japan project, the CJ project, as we called it, was developed thanks very much to the work of Peter Abdale, for example, in making that connection, and it flourished for many years. The Rural Policy Institute in Iowa, the health and wildfire researchers at the University of Lethbridge were involved, and of course, the basis for the Rural Policy Learning Commons now that operated out of Brandon from 2014. So what did we learn? Well, we learned a lot about rural and remote places, and I can only end up encouraging you to take a look at the materials on the NRE website, looking at the reports, presentations, publications. We learned a lot about community capacity, social cohesion, social capital, about the operation of small towns. Obviously, a lot with respect to the 4 themes of governance, environment, services, and communication. We also learned a lot about managing and organizing large projects, and of course, knowledge mobilization. These insights, we feel, shouldn't be lost as rural, remote, and more central communities face new challenges. They can be used to ask better questions and make useful comparisons for research, advocacy, and policy for the future. We're particularly interested in the promotion of this legacy and the opportunities it provides for current and future research, policy, and community action. And we're hoping it will be reflected in course papers, theses, publications, and new projects of the upcoming generation of researchers. So take a look at those materials, and I will now turn the podium, the online podium, over to Laura, who will tell us a bit about how the NRE project continues to support this vision and the activities at UNBC. So I'm going to stop my sharing, and I will leave the podium up to you, Laura.
Excellent. And it really is a pleasure to be able to join you all here today from our traditional territory of the Lheidli-T'enneh in the northern interior of British Columbia, and to really expand and talk about how we have continued to pursue new directions that build upon our time with the New Rural Economy project. And since the NRE, we've continued to build our research directions on all of the 4 key themes that were part of Bill's robust vision for rural Canada. And so I want to start by talking about services. Of course, we were really part of the services team with the New Rural Economy project. And since our time with the NRE, where we were focused on looking at innovative service models, we've expanded that and we've conducted research in 35 small municipalities throughout the province in order to explore how local governments were working with local service providers in order to develop more smart or shared infrastructure arrangements. Again, that's really important because of all the challenges around aging infrastructure, energy inefficient infrastructure that can exist. So as we're starting to rethink about how we're going to be renewing the infrastructure in these communities, these were important questions that were emerging. And so we, in particular, focused on multi-purpose or co-location initiatives, where you would have local governments coming together with different service agencies, public libraries, daycares, chambers of commerce, etc., in order to reduce some of their capital and operating costs. We also looked at a number of nonprofit service cooperatives where groups were not only co-located, but they were also streamlining or sharing some of their administrative or operational supports. And we also looked at some of those multi-service or one-stop shops that were in rural British Columbia as well. And we learned a tremendous amount, not just about different ownership models, but also about all of the governance issues that had to be worked through, not only during the development of these initiatives, but also throughout their operations as well. We are also examining how small municipalities are exploring entrepreneurial solutions in order to address some of the infrastructure and operating pressures through a number of different municipal enterprises and P3 partnerships. And I'm glad that we have a number of people on the meeting today who are a part of that work, including Ryan and John and Joshua as well. And the growth of municipal enterprises is really taking off, especially in our smallest communities. So in British Columbia alone, the number of municipal enterprises that, has now reached a peak of 35 in 2019. And the key message here is that these are largely being pursued by our smallest communities who have less than 5,000 people, and to a lesser extent by communities that have between 5,000 and 15,000 people. Now, across Canada, there were also municipalities pursuing a number of different municipal enterprises, whether it be through community forests, looking at affordable housing corporations, owning pipelines, developing water reclamation facilities in order to sell reclaimed water back to industry, developing business incubators, healthcare innovation, real estate development, seniors housing, and so much more. But the key thing is that we still have a really limited understanding of just how complex these enterprises are to develop and to operate within the fiscal and legislative limitations that municipalities have. In terms of the environment, there's certainly been an increase in community resource management through the expansion of community forests. And we've seen a number of municipalities that are developing community forests with their adjacent Indigenous communities as a part of reconciliation. And so when they generate those profits, those are being distributed equally between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. We also know that there are many small towns that remained locked in that resource-based dependency that is now at risk because of some of the pressures from climate change and that transition into a post-carbon economy. And so there are emerging concerns that that is leading to more uneven development. And so we know there's an urgent need to understand how our small communities are being better positioned to be able to capture and benefit from that post-carbon economy when a lot of these small places are structurally disadvantaged in order to achieve that just transition. And then lastly, we know that there continue to be all kinds of challenges with deficiencies related to broadband infrastructure. That, of course, was highlighted during the COVID pandemic when challenges with broadband infrastructure continue to undermine the growth and potential for businesses and for education in rural remote regions. But the key problem is this is now becoming an even greater challenge as we start to see more industries pursuing the digitalization of their resource-based sectors. So we're seeing a lot more activity where oil and gas, mining, forestry companies are using artificial intelligence, machine learning, unmanned vehicles, blockchain technologies. And these are all being adopted in rural Canada. And we know from experiences that are being observed around the world that a lot of these industries are now developing more remote operating centers. And so that is allowing a lot of these jobs to be performed remotely from larger communities. And so moving forward, we know that there is a really important task ahead of us in order to get a better grasp of how the digitalization of the resource sector is affecting rural economies across Canada. So with that said, again, I'm just going to really thank you, Bill, for all of his vision and all of his efforts to support all of us through that journey with the new rural economy over many years. And I'm glad to see so many people on this call who are a part of that project. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Evan.
Thank you, Laura. As Kristen introduced me, I'm Evan Curley. I'm in the midst of a PhD program at Dalhousie University. I've lived and worked in rural Nova Scotia my whole life, but I was not involved in the original NRE project. Somehow they still have managed to give me the last word on this presentation, so I'll take that. In what's now about the last year or so, I've come to know the folks of the NRE and the extensive work that they've did 20, 25 years ago. And so from this new to the NRE perspective, I'm going to share some of the opportunities and resources that the project might offer me in my research and also to other new rural researchers. And there are a lot of resources, some very tangible things and pragmatic things, and some more ineffable qualities that can be learned from a collaborative rural research project like the NRE. So I forgot how much information I gave to Kristen in my bio about my current project, so I won't reiterate that too much again, but just to give you a little bit more context of what I'm doing in my doctoral work. My project is looking at a lot of the challenges that Nova Scotia is facing right now to ensure social and economic well-being of its coastal communities. So these include enacting settler Indigenous reconciliation on land and at sea, maintaining and creating good jobs in rural areas, creating social and cultural cohesion in increasingly diverse rural populations, and managing natural resources, ensuring broadly distributed benefits. As Kristen mentioned, my PhD research starts with the practice of boat building as a jumping off point to consider many of these challenges. So I'm going to be doing an ethnographic study of traditional boat building and fishing in Nova Scotia, where I'm going to build a vernacular wooden boat and let that guide me through my field sites. So it should lead me into observations and conversations and work with other builders, fishers, rural craftspeople, and so on. That's going to allow me to make connections for interviews, and it'll give me a kind of a point of view and a focal point to make observations on coastal life. And it's a point of view that I hope takes seriously the interrelatedness of ourselves and others and our environment and the materials and the labor of our lives. So for me, even though I don't have, don't directly remember the NRE project, there's so much that lives on in its materials and in the NRE network that can offer a lot of guidance and insight to researchers. As a qualitative researcher, I gravitated a lot towards the interview materials that are in the NRE archives. And they did all kinds of interviews with key informants in each of their field sites. And as I was looking through them, I found this interview excerpt with Essie Green, who was the former mayor of Winterton, Newfoundland. Essie was involved in the early promotion of the Winterton Boat Building and Community Museum, which later in 2008 expanded into the Wooden Boat Museum of Newfoundland and Labrador, which is a very important kind of cultural institution for people who are interested in Atlantic boat building. And in the interview, Essie talks about how the town council was central to the museum's early initiatives, and how the idea for the museum was built from council members who had similar experiences in other rural sites. So Essie's describing how there was this intentional search for some aspect of their local culture that could become a focal point for the maintenance of identity as the economy was changing around them. And since boat building was this activity that was historically important, and there were still some local people with masterful skills in the activity, they chose to strengthen their community's identity in that direction with the establishment of this museum. Essie goes on to describe how local craftspeople got involved, building wooden boats with locally harvested wood. And this was all found, like I said, in the NRE archive under the Winterton site profile, with the heading "Encountering an Alternative Economic Activity for the Cod Fishery Collapsed in 1992." So it provides a really important image for my project. It's a snapshot of this transition that rural economies were going through, where traditional boat building was leaving the realm of utility and entering the realm of heritage, with a revitalized presence in the community as this beacon of identity. This moment signals new forms of prosperity for coastal communities, while at the same time acting as a reminder of the changing forms of fishing technology and labor relations fueled by capitalist incentives that ultimately led to the cod collapse and massive restructuring of these rural places. So for many of the folks involved in the NRE, they would have lived through a lot of this restructuring and these changes. But for an emerging scholar, a young scholar like me, we kind of have to piece together a picture of this time in order to understand and relate it to the context that we now study. And that's exactly what this NRE archive can do for me and for others. There's a lot of other really great pragmatic resources that the NRE offers. Photos for visual sociology projects, all kinds of publications, books, dissertations, government reports. But there's also a lot of really good methodological guidance. One of the things I found that I really liked were interview guides from the project. So there was one called Social Cohesion and Impressions of Community. And one of the questions that I really liked in this guide was, what, in your opinion, are the words that best describe how things get done in this community? And I think that's a really simple but effective question. It's probably not a good question to objectively learn how things get done, because depending on who you talk to, I think you'll get big gaps in how people perceive things getting done and how they actually get done. I can attest to that in my own rural community. But I imagine if you analyze the responses to a question like this with a narrative perspective, listening to the stories that people tell of how things are happening in their town, you'll get a sense of who the characters are in a rural environment. What are their social relations? Who's antagonistically or peacefully related to one another? What are the local values of work, self-sufficiency, those kinds of things. Questions like this are something that I'll probably use in my research. And why reinvent the wheel when you have these materials that you can access and use in your own research? It's a great way of going about doing it. As mentioned earlier, Bill has been maintaining the Surf in the Archives page on the Surf website. And a little while ago, I came across an important post. I think it's important. Bill wrote, singing and dancing have always been a feature of surf events and research activities. Yes, singing can be a research methodology indeed. Bill continues saying, this was joyously reinforced by our early decision to meet in rural and remote places. And indeed, the NRE has its own musical legacy in the form of song adaptations, local radio broadcasts, kitchen sing-alongs, choral performances that are all captured in the NRE songbook. And indeed, when I got connected with the NRE folks, they were singing on the first Zoom meeting that I attended. So that is really part of their day-to-day activities. As Bill puts it in that post, rural and remote research is much more than data collection, analysis, and reports. And I think that's really true. And that leads to the last resource of the NRE that I want to mention, which is beyond all the pragmatics of rural statistics and field site profiles and all that. For me, getting involved with the NRE has shown me a lot of values that are important in a research activity. I think the NRE rural researchers do a really good job at, cutting pretense and just relating to people in a way that's productive for them in their context and their local communities. And they just enjoy the building of connections through research participation, and I think that's key. Humor also and camaraderie is a mainstay of rural lives that all of these NRE folks have captured in their work, but it's also an attribute of this research team itself, and that's important. I think it shows us something about relating to people in a grounded way. So there it is, from interview data to methodological guidance to these more general approaches to academic work. I think the NRE has a lot to offer. It's a great resource for emerging rural researchers, for teachers who might want to pass on materials or get their students involved with some of these insights and data. And it's great information for folks outside of the university, of course, that are working on advocacy or policy issues. So with that, I'll conclude our presentation. And just to finish things off, Bill asked me to mention again the table of contents document that we prepared that has all kinds of links to aspects of the NRE project. That's a great resource for understanding more about the NRE project itself, and as a kind of a jumping off way for anyone to get involved in feeding off of and continuing the NRE legacy. So that's it. Thank you very much.
So perhaps we can open it up for some questions if anybody would like to chime in. Rose, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all of your presentations. My questions are actually towards you. You mentioned in your presentation a trend in the rural economies where we see the use of artificial intelligence, digitalization of agriculture. I was wondering if you could comment, thinking in the lines of settler colonialism and digital capitalism, is that as the rural economies get datafied, whether it is artificial intelligence or precision agriculture, how the rural communities are going to negotiate their rights in the area of data governance, that, okay, you are getting that rural data, but where is our say, how our voice is heard and represented?
Yeah, those are fantastic questions. They're going to have to be maneuvered going forward. At UNBC, we've been more focusing on a little less on agriculture and a lot more looking at how this is starting to emerge in forestry, mining, and oil and gas. But this is really in the infancy. It's compared to some other jurisdictions around the world, like Australia. We're just starting to see this getting rolled out. And there is a little bit of a concern by the federal government and a number of provinces as well about Canada and Canadian industries losing their competitiveness. So they are trying to create hubs that are nurturing the uptake of digital technologies first. And there has not been sufficient conversations yet about how we're building the capacity of rural communities to benefit or to engage in those issues that you've just highlighted. So that is something that will have to be addressed more going forward.
Yeah, and I just had one added question to that. As the rural economies of Canada comes under digital network, at the same time, we understand the neoliberal marginalization hurts the rural economies, so which makes them increasingly susceptible to communication disorders like misinformation, disinformation. We haven't seen a lot of discussions around that how the rural parts of Canada can potentially be impacted by communication disorder or information disorder. Any comments on that? Any discussions around that?
That has not been the focus of what we've been looking at in terms of our research. We have just been more focusing on how that is being uptaked in the workplace or by these industries. And so those are separate conversations that will have to be looked at in other types of projects.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to add to that as well. These are new issues. Remember, we were doing our work in the infancy of the internet and so on, and the idea that these issues are new is exactly the kind of reason why we're very interested in the new generation of researchers picking up some of these questions. The new generation of researcher includes some of us old fogies, by the way. It's the new questions that are emerging that is the real focus here. So I'm hoping, for example, that your questions regarding data are picked up by Nelson Rogers as he's considering the proposals to CRRF regarding the question of data, and to any of you who are saying, oh, now there's something that's worthwhile spending thesis time or report time on. And I would reiterate that the framework that we have and the connections and the history we have with these communities is an excellent framework for addressing these new questions as they emerge. And we've got lots of people who would be willing to help out in that respect.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Reimer.
Any last questions?
I think John has a question.
Yeah, so one thing that was kind of touched on, I think someone said something in the comments here, was kind of that element of developing social capital within the research team. It seems like for such a large and impactful project, such as the New Rural Economy project, that was at least at one of the many items at the heart of things. I'm just curious if that relationship building and that closeness, including stuff like the songbook and stuff, has impacted how you kind of conceptualize, especially larger research projects, and kind of the role that has in them. I know that's a pretty abstract question. I'm curious about it.
Bill, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I can certainly attest to the number of questions that I get, I'm sure other people get, that are related to that, in the sense of, how did you do this? That's the general formulation. But often what they mean by that is to both mobilize people and also to build the kind of familiarity and interactions that were so critical to the project. One thing that I think was really significant in that is that we, as I had mentioned, decided we would always meet in rural areas. And what that meant is that people devoted the time to go there. We saw common conditions and we met people. Those people in the communities were consulted, were part of the research process. And that, I think, was extremely significant. It meant you were hanging out, basically, with your fellow researchers. I have no idea how the current conditions of the internet and the ease of communication and the reluctance to spend the carbon that is necessary to get to these places. I don't know how that affects some of the issues that you're mentioning, John. But I certainly think that that's an important issue to address, not only from the point of view of the sort of question of social capital, but also the very pragmatic questions of getting things done collectively, because I think research is a collective process. It's always important element of doing good research is the collaboration. So I think it's an important question, but we haven't really had a long time to explore that. And as I say, the NRE was working under conditions where this was not a major issue. The RPLC, it became an issue in a different way. So there may be material from that experience.
Well, thank you for that response. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
I could also add that when we were in Benito, we did have some of our researchers go and talk to the students about how they felt that they were being engaged to strengthen that cohesion in an interdisciplinary research team. And we did publish something on that. So it was myself with Greg and Deb Thien and some others that we put that together. It showed lots of good lessons when you're trying to get students on board and to engage with all different kinds of mentors from across the country. Lots of fantastic lessons there about how to onboard them, providing a good orientation, getting them engaged, not just in formal meetings, but also getting them engaged in, in a less formal capacity as well, whether it be going to events where everyone's singing and dancing, or attending different, even just being around, having office space and connecting, and then being engaged not just as data collectors, but as a broad range of research activities. So very good lessons there.
Thank you.
Okay, at this stage, we're coming up to the top of the hour, so perfect timing. I'd like to give a big thanks once again to Evan, Laura, and Bill for excellent and very interesting presentations. And now we'll move on, if that's okay with everyone, to the slightly more mundane work of the AGM proper.